walking. We will share your love by building community. We will share your love.
Before we start, just because it's vaguely amusing, so I got AI to make me this cover image for the God is Bigger Than Theology is what we're talking about. So I got AI to make me the cover picture, and then I said, can you make that picture there be me? And they uploaded a picture of me because I thought it'd be cool if that was me. And then so just for hilarity, let me show you. This is what it gave me. I'm not quite sure where that came from, but apparently I won the World Cup. Yeah, who knew? But that's not the World Cup. I don't know what the trophy. Anyway, is it the World Cup trophy? Anyway. Okay, so what I want to speak about this morning is I was reading I don't like labels of sort of denominations and things like that because I think they can be problematic and people read stuff into a label which isn't necessarily there. But I would think it's fair to say that we would probably be categorised as progressive in our sort of thinking as a church. And I saw a thing that's like a sort of description of what the progressives believed. And one of the things was that God is bigger than the theology. And I thought, I quite like that, so I wanted to run with that a bit this morning. So, since the dawn of time itself, mankind has had a belief in gods. There is evidence 200,000 years ago of Neanderthals burying their dead with artifacts that suggest a belief in the afterlife. As long as human history has been around, there's been a belief in the afterlife and something bigger than ourselves, and the Creator. Belief in the Creator, I think, is sort of hardwired into our existence, and it always has been. And knowing what we do now about how we believe we are made in God's image, it's hardly surprising that a belief in the Creator, which is in essence who we are, is hardwired into us. And then, as old as a belief in God, we have theology. So theology is the systematic study of God, the study of God, religious beliefs, and the nature of the divine. It's the academic study of God, basically. The word comes from two words, theos in Greek, which means God, and then logos, which means to study. Logos, I looked into this because logos is also the word used to describe Jesus in the book of John, where it says Jesus was the Word. And it appears the Greek sort of word logos has lots of different sort of different meanings. But we shouldn't read into this that theology means God and then Jesus. It's a study of God. It's the study or reasoning about God. Theology is humanity's attempt to understand the divine. It's our attempts to understand God. The earliest evidence of a Jewish faith comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were believed to be written about 2200 BC, so well over 4,000 years ago. We have Neanderthals 200,000 years ago showing evidence of a belief in the Creator. We have the Jewish faith 4,000 years ago. Christianity, in the form of Jesus, survived 2,000 years ago. And since then, the theology around our faith, what Christians believe, has been refined by theologians like Apostle Paul, Augustine, St. Anselm, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, generations of theologians, some building on each other's work, some disregarding other people's work and creating their own systems, who have built upon the theology that built on theology. And right now there are hundreds of religions in the world, each of whom claim to have the understanding of the one true God. Each of whom believe that they're right and everybody else is wrong. And even within each religion, people will literally go to war about theology. There have been wars fought about pieces of bread in Christian circles and in Christian life, and what a piece of bread does when you eat it. People have literally gone to war over beliefs like that. Even within Keighley, you'll find a dozen different Christian churches, each with their own understanding of theology. Each adamant that they're right, and others are not. If we think about our Muslim friends, we think of the Muslim faith in general, but if you go down to an individual mosque, they will have different beliefs to another mosque, and different the difference between what Sunni and Shia Muslims believe, and even more fine than that. And we need to realise that people who aren't Christians feel the same way about the church. They don't realise that there's different beliefs and different systems within what they see as the church. They just see Christianity. They just see the church. And theology, in a way, is each of our attempts to understand God. And I quite like this quote. This is the American journalist H.L. Mencken, and he said, "Theology is the effort to explain the unknowable in terms of a not worth knowing." I'm not against theology, right? We should absolutely study God. We should try better to understand him. If we're made in his image, studying and understanding God is also trying to study and understand ourselves. But in a way, my message this morning is a caveat to basically any sermon you've ever read or listened to. We have to be very careful in our pursuit of understanding God, in our pursuit of theology, that we don't get a little box and we put God in it, a box called theology, and we keep him in there. God is bigger than any theology can be. The Dutch priest, Henry Nouwen, says, "Theological formation is a gradual and often painful discovery of God's incomprehensibility. You can be competent in many things, but you cannot be competent in God." What he means there is competent in your understanding of God. Because there's so much more. I like this from a guy called Matt Chandler, who wrote a book called The Explicit Gospel. He says, "Trying to figure out God is like trying to catch a fish in the Pacific Ocean with an inch of dental floss." And going back further in time, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment, said, "We degrade God too much, ascribing to him our ideas in vexation at being unable to understand him." God is indescribable and incomprehensible, at least for the moment. Theology, by its very nature, aims to help us describe and comprehend God, and we should try to do that. But in order to try and comprehend God, we have to put him into terms that we understand and that we can comprehend. And in that process of trying to put human terms and human thinking around God, we're always going to lose something about who God is and what God is when we try to do that. I think this is what Paul is referring to in 1 Corinthians 13, where he says this. And this is a Message translation. "Inspired speech will be over someday. Praying in tongues will end. Understanding will reach its limit. We know only a portion of the truth, and what we say about God is always incomplete. But when the complete arrives, our incompletes will be cancelled. When I was an infant in my mother's breast, I gurgled and cooed like any infant. When I grew up, I left those infant ways for good. We don't yet see things clearly. We're squinting in a fog, peering through a mist. But it won't be long before the weather clears and the sun shines bright. We'll see it all then, see it all as clearly as God sees us, knowing him directly just as he knows us. As I said, I'm not against theology. We should and must attempt to understand God. But if anyone says, got God, completed God, done that, then they don't understand him. They're demonstrating that they don't have that understanding. A little hero of mine is Richard Feynman, a physicist. And he said, but anyone who claims to understand quantum theory is either lying or crazy. Because if you understand quantum physics, you're showing that you claim to understand it, you actually don't. And I think we can probably say something similar about God. If you're arrogant enough to claim to understand and comprehend the incomprehensible, then you've either missed out on a huge part of what God is, or you're deliberately being dishonest, or a bit crazy. We must always recognize that God is beyond our comprehension. We can't let our ego take hold and tell us that we've completed theology. We must always be humble enough to know that there's more to understand. My personal theology and way of thinking about God has changed hugely over the last 10 years. And I think we'd be naive to say that where we are now, we're not going to progress even further and develop that understanding or change that understanding further. I'm sure in 10 years' time, I'll look back on things that I'm thinking today and realise that I think about those the same way I think about some of the stuff that I thought I was convinced about 10 years ago now. We're constantly evolving. In his book, A More Christ-Like God, Brian McLaren uses the analogy that when we were too small to count, when we were small, we learned to count. We mastered our times tables. We learned to add and subtract, and we think that we get maths. We've mastered maths. But then we get to the next level, and someone tells you, well, actually, letters, they can be numbers too. And we're introduced to algebra. And algebra takes our understanding of maths to another level. We then may think we understand that. And then someone talks to you about complex numbers and imaginary numbers. And there's always another level of understanding that we can go to. As humanity's understanding of God and theology evolves, I believe that God reveals more of himself in a way that we can all comprehend. As our ability to comprehend increases, as we build on the theology, then God reveals more and more to help us understand him. But we must never believe that we have reached a pinnacle. In that passage in Corinthians where Paul talks about one day it will be complete, that is when we are fully restored to being with God. So, what can we be certain of? If we can never fully understand God, what can we be sure about? What bedrock and what foundations can we build our theology on? Now, if we go back to that passage from Corinthians, I deliberately left the first and last bits out of it when we read it earlier. So the bits in red, we're adding in. So it starts off by saying, love never dies. And then at the end, it says, but for right now, until that completeness, we have three things to do. Lead us forward towards that consummation, to trust steadily in God, to hope unswervingly, to love extravagantly. And the best of all three is love. Faith, love, and hope is how that other translations put that. It all comes back to love. Because love is what we can be sure and certain of. We know that God is love. Love is the bedrock and the foundation of faith. Love is the golden thread that weaves right the way through time from those Neanderthal graves to today. We said earlier we are hardwired to believe in a creator. I believe we are also hardwired to love. love each other and love God. Proof of this is how even in the darkest corners of human history, you can find stories of love. You can find stories of people caring for each other against great adversity. The human tendency to want to look after each other and to care for each other is there in each of us. We should absolutely do our best to try and understand theology, but we have to recognise that God is bigger than any theology. And as Paul says there, we should always hope unswervingly and love extravagantly. In our quest to try and comprehend the incomprehensible God, we must be careful that we don't put limits on him based on our own limited understanding. One day we will have a complete understanding, but that's not yet. Because I think some of the greatest atrocities in history have occurred when people have reduced God to a theology. They've put him in a box that represents their own prejudices, their own worldviews, and said, this is God. But God is so much bigger than the box that they've put him in. In an attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible, well-intentioned people invent rules, religion, logic. They call it theology. They then make it blasphemy to say you disagree with it and question it. And what you end up with is often something that looks nothing like the Creator God. So where there is uncertainty, where there are apparent contradictions in Scripture or opinion, and there are those, the Bible, there are loads of contradictions in the Bible. What we need to do is play it safe and stick with what we know to be true, which is God is love. Extravagant and unconditional love. Because that's the one thing we know for certain about God. Let's not get caught up in arguments, debates, and culture wars. And let's go with love. If in doubt, go with love. Love wins. The only mission is love. God is love. We are in union with God. We are love. So just make this clear that I'm not saying we shouldn't try to understand God, but we have to recognise that he's way bigger and way more complex. God made the universe. I struggle to work out how to make a cup of coffee some days in the morning. How we can't expect to understand that in its fullness. There will always be questions, always be things we don't understand. And what people like John Calvin have done in history is an attempt to understand him, put rules and laws in place, and try to box God in and confine him in these ways of thinking. And then you end up having to go down rabbit holes to complete the logic of all of that. And you end up with something that doesn't resemble God. But God is love. That's the be-all and end-all of it. So when there's a debate about, what does the Bible say about this? What's God's opinion on this? Is this something we should be doing or not? We should recognise that we don't know. No one has a full picture. But the best thing we can do is to err on the side of love, because we know that's always where he is. Does anybody want to comment or expand on that in any way? Or Eileen looks like she wants to say something. Yeah? Do you think? Yeah, absolutely. If you got something. Let me give you a mic. Is that on, Joshua? The yellow one?
Hello.
There we go. I should clarify, because I can tell from Annie's body language, I always want to encourage people to say if they don't agree with what I'm saying, so we can have a discussion about it.
I can see where you're coming from, because really you're diluting it down to a basic thing. Yeah. But there are quite a lot of verses that say nobody knows God and nobody can see him. But But if you want to know what God is like, then you look at Jesus.
Yeah, completely agree with that.
But I think what you might say from your point of view is that people are misinterpreting him as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So people say different things about Jesus as well. So, but Jesus came to show love to people, didn't he?
Yeah.
But it says, I think it's Hebrews 1. In the past, we got glimpses through the previous experiences of people. But now God has sent his Son to show us who he's really like. And that was the point of his coming and being made flesh and acting like a person. And so for me, I would say if you wanted to know and work out who God would be to read the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, really. But as you say, and I think that you might say, is that people misinterpret that. So if there's any confusion about what Jesus says or does, then you've reduced it down. You say, if you interpret Jesus and that doesn't include love, unconditional love, then that's not who Jesus is.
Yeah, I think people try to put... Keep that for a second, you might want to jump back in. I think people try, as I say, people try to put God... in an attempt to understand God, like Calvin's a perfect example of this, as I said, and you end up like, well, so if you're going to go to heaven, you go down this black and white way of thinking of tree of knowledge of good and evil, rather than the tree of life, and you go that, well, if you're going to get to heaven, you have to do this, and then you have to go, well, is that a sin? Is that a sin? Is that a sin? Is that a sin? Oh, but then that's a sin. But what happens if this is a situation? And you end up just going on loads of rabbit holes and missing the whole picture. And at the end of the day, the picture is God is love. Jesus is God. Jesus was love. And that is the bedrock of our theology. But in any attempt to understand him, I'm thinking like we've had lots of discussions around heaven and hell, is Satan real, and all those, is Satan an actual entity as such, or is it representing our ego? All those sorts of discussions. And they're great discussions to have. They're great discussions to try and understand. But we have to recognise that we're never going to be able to fully comprehend all those situations yet. And when in doubt, we always act out of love. Does that make sense? Yeah. You can apply that to people who believe in a literal 7-day creation, and like, how can we understand how God made the universe? The important thing is God did make the universe. We can't understand how he did it. We can try to understand it, but we're never going to be able to understand that. And that's why then we put these stories in place of these metaphors, like the 7-day creation we read about in Genesis, which tries to help us to understand that. But then people take that literally and build a whole theology around it.
I always feel that people will talk about anything except Jesus. They won't talk about him. They want to talk about the end of the world, the Jewish question, Israel, the beginning of the world, any other issue, but they won't talk about the revelation of God in Jesus. They just won't do it. They won't read the Old Testament.
It's too challenging, isn't it?
They won't read the New Testament. They prefer the Old and all this. And you just think, well, go where it's no good going into all of that, because that's not what God came to say about. He came to say, this is who I am, and this is who I am to you, and this is who you are to me.
But we also have to be humble enough to, like, people have been studying greater, more intelligent, brilliant minds have been studying theology for thousands of years, and for us to say that, oh, I'm right, what I believe is right, everybody else, all this other stuff has to be wrong, that's that's really arrogant, particularly like how I know how my theology has changed over 10 years, and that probably will continue to change. So, yeah, we don't want to be boxing our theology in and saying, I've done this, and everybody else must be wrong. And that goes to both sides of the argument. I was having discussions yesterday with people who believe different things to me on some really fundamental issues. But we could all agree that God is love, and then we were able to be humble enough and understand that other people have different opinions on things.
I think where it really goes wrong is when people think that they know it all, which is what you're saying, isn't it? I mean, they think that you can, put God in amber and just go, right, we know everything there is to know, and you just have to agree with it. Well, that can never be the case. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And there's too much of that in religion. This is what it is. And don't you dare disagree or think differently.
No, because God's on my side, and if you disagree with me, God's going to get you. And if you